Thank you, Paige and Robert, for getting us started. And I am always grateful for the opportunity to co-present with Association Reserves and you, Robert. One opening point about this presentation, yes, most of our attendees are association volunteers, but this is also something that I hope will be very helpful to our professional managers, because you're in a position where you can instill positive values and help educate the board members that you work with from year to year. You're on the front lines. We lawyers have only so much opportunity to help not all of our associations pursue annual board training as many of mine do. And so I hope this will be instructive and helpful for the professional manager as well as for the volunteer. Well, famous old saying from a guy named Ben Franklin, you may remember him. He's the guy on the hundo, the $100 bill. If you don't prepare, you're preparing to fail. And there are many other versions of this. I'm reminded, I think, of Zig Ziglar, a modern motivational speaker, who said something similar. If you don't set a target, you'll hit at what you aim for, something like that. So it's important for association success to have a target and to have goals and to move toward these goals. So we're going to talk today about foundations of successful board service. We're going to have very little law in this presentation. It's more the base attitudes and the basis of a successful association service. As we talk about foundations and so-called pouring the concrete, we might want to point out that you could have the association laws in your state memorized. You could be a licensed attorney and a civil engineer and a contractor and have taken all the manager credential courses that are available and have multiple advanced degrees, and you could be the worst member of your board, because it's not knowledge that's the foundation. Knowledge adds to the foundation, but if you build an unhealthy foundation, you're not going to be a good board member no matter how expert you are in your field. We're going to talk about some of the reasons why that knowledge is really the second thing built on a positive foundation. Attitude absolutely makes the difference. The attitude that you pursue, how you look at board service, how you look at your colleagues, and how you look at your neighbors that are sitting in the audience of the board meeting makes all the difference between a positive board and a dysfunctional association and dysfunctional board where it's truly uncomfortable to attend a board meeting because of the negativity in the room. That negativity is avoided and positivity is embraced by intentionally pursuing certain positive attitudes. So let's go to one of the most basic, and that is an attitude of the servant leader in your association. I can't underscore enough that board members in associations need to always keep in mind that their position is a position of service, not control. They are not the boss of the association. They are servants helping their community. And similarly, leadership, board position, officer position, even the position of association president is not some honor or distinction or some treasure to be protected. It's a duty. It's a duty. It's a moment in which you agree to step up to the plate and do your level best to serve and help your neighbors and to get somebody ready to take their turn to do the same. If you have an attitude that HOA leadership is somehow special or to be protected, you're going to be one of those board members who emails or calls me and says, hey, homeowner Jones said the board's doing a terrible job and I want you to write a letter threatening them with a slander lawsuit. That's not the right attitude. So right away, recognize that you are a servant to your neighbors. If you have board members who take a position that they're the boss and that they're sort of the policemen of your community, those are more likely to be a problem for your manager, your board, and me. So it's all about service. A second thing in this attitude department is make sure you separate your value as a human being from what you do in the board meeting and the decisions and the arguments and the positions that you put forward as a member of your board of directors. The fact that somebody disagrees with your position on which painting contractor to hire does not mean you're a bad person and does not mean that director thinks you're a bad person. So don't confuse board activities, disagreements, even criticism with your value as a human being. They are totally separate. And if you don't separate them, you're going to be unhappy, because guess what? Unless you've been on a board only 1 week, you're going to face criticism and disagreement. And there's nothing wrong with that, but you've got to handle it in the right way. The attitude absolutely makes the difference in how you deal with your neighbors, how you deal with your colleagues on the board, and how you deal with your manager too. Well, another important attitude is understanding what you don't understand. Many years ago, there was a series of films called The Dirty Harry. It started with Dirty Harry in the early 70s. I think the second movie in the series was a film called Magnum Force with one of my favorite actors, Clint Eastwood. And I realized that a lot of people in the audience probably weren't here in '73, let alone watch the movie. But one of the famous quotes from that, from Inspector Harry Callahan, who's shown in this picture, of course, with a gun in front of him, is that a man's got to know his limitations. Well, I think that really applies to board service as well. So you can see I've edited it a little bit, and I've taken it to our world. A director's got to know their limitations. We have to recognize, if we're going to be a truly outstanding board member, we have to acknowledge we don't know it all. We can't know it all. We aren't expected to know it all. And that's why you have lots of different people helping you. You have a credentialed manager, a professional manager, helping execute your decisions and bring you information for further decisions. You have consultants, experts, you have committees, you have your other director colleagues on the board, all with different information, background, and experience. And of course, you have the neighbors in your community who come to open forum or who come and send emails to manager of the board. They all know things, and they may know things that you don't know. So don't worry that you don't know it all. You aren't expected to know it all. And the people that always scare me are the ones who think they know it all, because those are people who didn't acknowledge their limitations. So understand and embrace the fact that you're going to learn things from other people. You're going to see perspectives from other people who are seeing things in a way you don't see. And be willing to dialogue, not just simply state your opinion and then either I win or lose, but listen to this other information. It may change your point of view. So that embracing limitations is helpful. Another attitude that's critical is you've got to be neighborly. At all costs, you have to avoid hostility, and you have to avoid escalating hostility when it happens. One way you can do that is how you initially start dealing with people who are breaking association rules. You know, a lot of times I find that board members and even managers, and yes, even my attorney colleagues, when somebody breaks an association rule or use restriction, the assumption is that that person is just disrespecting the board, they're disrespecting their neighbors, they're disrespecting the rule itself. Well, that isn't always the case. In fact, my experience is that more often than not, these violations happen because people just didn't know they were making a violation. Nobody told them that there were certain things the association had to give permission for before they could happen. So when somebody puts up that purple patio cover on the side of their house, maybe they didn't know that they had to seek architectural committee approval. Maybe they didn't know that there were specific standards on the allowable palette of colors in your association. So start with the assumption that they're not disrespecting anybody. Start with the assumption they didn't know. And that's going to put you on a much less hostile position. Now, you know what? Some homeowners are going to prove you wrong. They're going to prove that they did know, and they just reject any kind of authority from the community. But I think those are the minority. I think what happens is that when a board or a manager responds with anger and hostility at a violation, guess what? It's reflected right back at them from the homeowner, who then becomes defensive and hostile. So in a similar vein, when you're dealing with violations, escalate your response to violations gently, deliberately, and not abruptly. Don't be so quick to come to us lawyers and say, we want you to send a litigation threat letter to homeowner Jones. Because sometimes a simple conversation, a simple warning, a nudge, maybe even just a visit from a board member. Hey, you know what, Kelly, that purple patio cover, you know, you're supposed to get architectural approval. Did you know that? Here, let me tell you how you can get the forms for this. there always is time to escalate all the way up to a legal threatening letter. I find that at this point in my career, after 30 years of working with HOAs, that more often than not, I'm not writing letters anymore from me. I'm ghostwriting letters for my manager, for my president, because I don't want to prematurely escalate the angst and the pressure from having an attorney letterhead on the letter. So think about escalating slowly, because once you escalate, it's really hard to de-escalate. We all know that. And lastly, look for opportunities to be a peacemaker between homeowners that are not getting along. Don't be too quick to decide who's the good guy and who's the bad guy. Everybody's got a point of view, and try to be a peacemaker in your association, and you'll help your community a lot. Another critical concept is basically unlearning something that you've spent your whole life learning. And that is that your night job as a volunteer is very different from your day job in the working world. You know, we learn that in the working world, there's a chain of command that's vertical. You have a boss, and you're the boss over somebody else. And in a for-profit, it's all about chain of command. And the chain of command is almost always a person who's given a certain area of responsibility. But in the community association, it's completely different. The chain of command is horizontal. It's horizontal, meaning there's a board of directors of 3, 5, 7, 9, or even 11 people who make the decisions for the corporation. So what that means is that no one person is the boss. The decider is the board of directors, and not any particular officer. And that's a real game changer for people, because in the working corporate world, in your day job, typically there will be a single person who is the decider of a certain type of issue, but not in the HOA world. The decider, the boss, is a group of people, not any one person. Each director's vote is the same value as the next director. Some people feel that the president's vote is somehow more powerful, but the president's vote isn't any more powerful than your vote. Your vote has the same legal effect as any of the other people that you serve with. And you have the right to vote how you see fit. And there's nothing wrong with you asserting your vote as part of the group. Once the decision is made, then we close ranks and we go forward as a team. But please remember, the president's power in a nonprofit mutual benefit corporation is dramatically less than in a for-profit corporation. In a for-profit corporation, the president has the power typically to hire and fire and decide on contracts and change policies all by the president's own self, but not in an HOA. And I will tell you that many of your bylaws lend some confusion in this area, because they often say in your bylaws, in the section regarding officers, it'll say that the president has the normal power of an officer of this type of corporation, something to that effect. Well, the problem is that unless somebody tells you, you don't know that the nonprofit mutual benefit president has far less power than a for-profit corporate president. What power does the president have other than casting their own vote? Well, they get to call meetings typically, they get to set agendas, typically they chair the meeting, and they call for the question as the chair, but they still only are one vote. So they really aren't any more powerful than anybody else. They have a little bit more visibility. Sometimes they're the spokesperson for the association, but it's a very different role. And unlearning the chain of command that you work with everywhere else and embracing the association's horizontal chain of command sets your association up for success. In the same vein, each individual director doesn't really have any authority all by themselves. You, the director, have a single vote, and your vote is, I don't mean to be offensive, but it's meaningless until a few other directors, enough to reach a majority of the board, agree with you, a majority of a quorum. When they agree with you, then your vote means something, but it only means something in conjunction with other owners. So that means that when you, the individual director, are dealing with vendors or the association manager or even neighbors in the community, it means that you have to show great restraint, because you really don't have the legal authority to tell a vendor or the manager or even a homeowner what to do. And that is such a critical concept. I was wondering if we could have a show of hands here. How many of you are hearing maybe this for the very first time, that individual directors have to exercise restraint, that you really aren't allowed to give instruction to anybody? We'll take a moment.
Kelly, hands are going up. About a quarter are saying this is brand new information to them. So I'm glad you brought up this point. Quarter, maybe
well, that's
a third.
Great. That's what makes this worthwhile. Thanks, Robert. So again, this changes the way that you operate as a director, and frankly, it also it keeps you within your role as a director, not as a co-manager. So let's talk about that, because a very common problem with association boards is the breaching of the boundaries of responsibility. As a director, your role is right in the title. You direct. Your manager manages. The manager executes the decisions that the board makes. The board makes decisions and does not execute the decisions. So the association pays vendors, employees, and the manager to execute for the board. And a lot of times when I'm dealing with boards that are struggling to fill vacant seats, a lot of times the problem is because a couple of directors are co-managing the association and spending 30 to 40 hours a week each working on association business. And they wonder why they can't get volunteers to fill the other seats. Well, it's because everybody's scared to give that kind of time commitment. Allow the manager to manage, allow them to do their job. And if you co-manage, not only are you going to hurt your board and your association, but you're also going to discourage your manager, who's paid to do the job that you hired them to do. When you're co-managing, you're not allowing them to do it. And a lot of times I'm told, well, Kelly, the reason I do it is because so-and-so isn't doing their job. Well, make them do their job. Instead of doing it for them, hold them accountable. We all want to be held accountable. We all want to be proud of the job we do. So don't co-manage. Be a director and give direction. That's what the group of you called the board does. Well, now let's move to a different area. We've talked about all these attitudes and understandings. Now let's talk about specifically preparing for board service. One of the most important things that you can do right off the bat before you decide to run for the board or ask to be appointed, read the governing documents. I guarantee you most of your community has not. Read your CC&Rs, read your bylaws, read your rules and regulations before you join the board, because you're responsible to comply with those and to follow the instructions in those documents. You might also want to consider joining the Community Associations Institute. It's an international organization with 45,000 members. It is throughout the United States. We have about 62 chapters, including one in South Africa, one in the United Arab Emirates, and Canada. And we're also helping educate members in Australia. The organization is all about improving association governance and training the very best professional managers we can get. To join, whether your association board is 3 members or 15 members, CI adopted a flat rate of $250 for the entire board to join. It's so inexpensive, and it opens up doors to all kinds of education. CI has education at the national level. There's a publication called From Good to Great that you can download and read. There's an interactive board training course that's fairly inexpensive, that's very sophisticated, lots of graphics, it's very interesting, that you can take. And your local CI chapter also offers courses ranging from 3 hours to 7 hours. Some chapters, such as the Orange County, California chapter of CI, offers, they call it their leadership training program, which is on multiple nights. So there's a lot of very inexpensive or free education CI offers. And lastly, as you're preparing for board service, think about the business judgment rule. Learn the business judgment rule, because that is what allows you to sleep at night. You're not getting paid for your board service. So it's not fair that you take on any legal risk. Well, fortunately, the business judgment rule, which is the rule in most, if not all, of the states in America, says that as long as you're trying your best, you're acting on the information that you need, and you're in good faith, and you're acting in the best interest of the association as a whole, then even if you make a mistake as a board, you will be protected from individual personal liability. So that's really critical. And in the materials that you're going to be downloading or receiving from Association Reserves will be a couple of articles from my newspaper column on the business judgment rule, and I would encourage you to read that because that's a very important set of boundaries that is there for your protection. Another set of things you can do to prepare for board service, it sounds kind of simple, but how about attending a few board meetings? Seeing how the board operates, seeing what kind of things they typically deal with. Show the board that you're interested and that you're listening and trying to learn. Also, think about talking to the manager. If they have some time, they'll give you 15 or 30 minutes for a phone call or a visit. Talk to the manager and find out what they think. Now, keep in mind, managers are not allowed to take sides or endorse or oppose candidates for the board. That's a specific breach of all of our professional ethics as the vendors and professionals that serve community associations. But you know what? They can tell you what they're looking for. They can tell you what they hope to get from board members. That's certainly fair. And see if you can learn a little bit about what's expected of you. Also, review the latest budget and the reserve study. Find out how the association's doing. Where is it spending its money? And absolutely see, is the association financially sound? Does it have the amount of funds in its reserve account that the reserve study says it should have? Is it making progress toward that goal? That's all information you should have before you join the board. And very importantly, please avoid predetermined agendas, campaign promises to your neighbors that if I'm elected or if I'm appointed to the board, I will do this or I will do that. I've seen people say, well, if I'm elected, I will make sure that assessments are not increased. Well, how can anybody say that honestly? You don't know what the expenses are. You don't know what the coming year is going to bring. If there are certain things that are going to be more costly, if things are more costly, then assessments are going to have to increase to deal with the increased expenses. That's just financial reality. Sometimes I see candidates for the board saying, well, if I'm elected, I'm going to fire the management company, or I'm going to fire the lawyer, I'm going to fire everybody.
You probably hear about, you're sensitive to that firing the lawyer thing.
Yeah.
I usually think about firing the, well, I won't go there.
It happens all the time.
Okay.
And it's sad because sometimes I'm hired by an association where they've had new board members elected and some other colleague of mine was the victim of that campaign promise.
Yeah.
Then you get on the board and you start learning the reality about the association situation. Now you're torn because you know that there are specific reasons why the assessments need to increase. So what do? Do you hold true to a campaign promise that was based on insufficient information and then do something that you know is unrealistic and not allow assessments to track actual expenses? Or do you go ahead and violate your campaign promise? And I've seen people elected to the board struggle with those very issues. So don't pin yourself in, don't make campaign promises, okay? That isn't healthy for HOAs. It's not any healthier for HOAs than it is for public office. Yeah. So watch for that. Another way that you can really help is to be great at board meetings once you join the board, okay? So you've fulfilled all the qualifications and preparations. Now you're attending the board meeting as a member of the board of directors. Please, for goodness sakes, read the agenda packet before the board meeting, not at the board meeting. The agenda packet typically is prepared for you, usually by the manager, days before the board meeting. It is the information you are asked to digest. It's the information that you are asked to base your decisions upon. So read it before. There's nothing more insulting to your other board colleagues to see a director come into the room, bring their board packet, and then start flipping through and reading it for the first time at the beginning of the meeting. That's just, might as well just have a sign on your forehead that says, I'm not prepared, and I'm going to be making snap judgments, because you really can't read the whole packet while you're sitting there, not effectively. So read the packet. That's, the managers spent a lot of time, a lot of effort. If we all of a sudden could have the managers take over the mic right now, I know they would have some stories to tell about all the work they put into those board packets. Please read them. Another thing that can really help your board meetings be more effective is just to simply stay on topic. Stay on target. It's a very common thing for boards and committees to get off track and to go down into the weeds in what I call rabbit trails. You know, there's that cartoon where they yell squirrel and everybody runs off to the, yeah, well, stay on target, because when you get off topic, not only are you wasting the board's time and you're elongating the meeting, but the Open Meeting Act says you can only discuss things which are actually on the agenda unless they're emergencies. So you're also violating the Open Meeting Act. So work together, stay on target, stay on topic. Now that typically is the chair's responsibility, but you all should be working together on that. Then another important thing that I see a lot is, please, board members, talk to each other. Please don't address the audience. When you address the audience instead of your board colleagues, you're doing two things. First of all, you're disrespecting your board colleagues because you're supposed to be discussing with your other voting directors the agenda motion at hand. So that's a problem. The second problem is when you start talking directly to the audience, you know what the audience thinks? That it's okay for them to talk back to you. And then we have disruptive meetings. So talk to each other. You may have to rearrange your seats a little bit so you can see each other, but talk to each other. Please don't talk to the audience. Also, ask the manager for input. Your manager is trained to give you advice and to refer you to the right experts and recognize when further help or information is needed. We'll use that information. You should be asking the manager for input on pretty much every motion. They're 95% of the time going to be your business judgment rule due diligence. So get in the habit of, once the motion is introduced, turn to the manager and say, well, do you have any input on this? Almost always the manager will have a recommendation. You may find that by asking the manager for their input first, as opposed to late in the discussion, you find that everybody's comfortable with that advice, and you may actually come to a decision more efficiently that way. The last slide on board meetings, there are 4 other points I want to make. First, treat open forum as important. Nay, treat it as critical. It is a very, very important community building time in your board meeting. Some boards look at open forum as a drudgery, as something to just get through. Well, that is not the attitude we want. Open forum is the time for you to hear from your neighbors things that you may not know. Hear from your neighbors what's important to them. You should be attentive during open forum. Listen, learn, take notes. That is the time for you to show respect to your neighbors in the community. Also, another thing you can do that will help your deliberations be more efficient is don't feel like you have to comment on every single motion. There are a lot of motions that are non-controversial. Well, if they're completely non-controversial, I'm hoping they'll be in the consent calendar. But if it's clear that everybody is in favor, the manager's recommended that we pay the electric bill, you don't need to comment on it. Just call for the question and say, and then cast your vote. You're not doing your job. Don't feel like you're not doing your job if you're not commenting on everything, okay? Listen, because the non-controversial items, just let them get to the items that require more discussion. Also, don't take offense at disagreement. There are 3, 5, 7, 9, or 11 people that were elected to represent the community with their different backgrounds and training and experience and viewpoints. Disagreement is expected. Don't take offense at it. Sometimes people see things differently. Allow people their points of view, and don't be afraid to take a vote and pass a motion on 4-1 or 3-2. That's okay. We don't want people to feel guilty because they vote against their neighbors, because again, you're separating your discussions as a board member from your worth as a person. If you make a motion that fails, it doesn't mean you're a bad person. It just means that your board colleagues think differently than you do on that issue. Doesn't mean they don't trust you. It means they think differently, and they're entitled to, just as you're entitled to think differently. And once the board vote happens, what do? You unite, and you go forward. And this is the last point, is, as Aretha Franklin said so beautifully in that wonderful song, R-E-S-P-E-C-T, respect your board colleagues. You're going to get the respect that you give. Don't demand respect before you give it. That's the wrong order. Show respect to your board colleagues when they disagree, when they're upset. Stay calm and show the community that you as a team of board members, you don't always think alike, but you respect each other as adults and as representatives of the community. And you're going to find that you have a much more positive, much more successful board experience. And guess what? you're going to find it much easier to identify volunteers to take your place and a much more harmoniously governed community. So there's one more thing that's important for really excellent associations, and that relates to making sure the association's financially sound and solvent. Robert, do you have some thoughts on that?
Sure. I want to keep it pretty simple. Kelly, you've set the foundation very nicely. I like that cement truck picture at the very beginning, but the job of the board really is to create a peaceful and productive community. And part of that is, as you've described, separating between your wants and your needs, looking to how I can best serve the association. And part of that is just understanding what we describe as the 4 reserve rules. It's really pretty simple. Reserves are not complicated. Just understanding that expenses are inevitable. The roof will fail. The entry gate will fail, and those things are going to happen just as much as the water bill is going to come. So those expenses are inevitable. The board's responsible, as you've described, for managing the affairs of the association. If the project is not done on time, or if the funds aren't there and you have to wait, those delays usually get expensive. Think about how a delayed paint project usually results in carpentry expenses and dry rot and problems like that. And remember that you're serving the association, and the association is made up of the owners, and the homeowners always get stuck paying the bill. So serve them well, and that means collecting the funds from them so you can sustain the association. You can sustain their homes and the property values, and just take good care of minimizing their expenses. Avoid those deferred maintenance high expenses. So it just fits in with the whole process of being a great board member. So Kelly, bring it in for a landing. Closing thoughts?
Well, thanks, Robert. I think that like anything in life, success is not accidental. It is the result of preparation and planning. And harmonious, successful board service is exactly the same. If you prepare for success, you can be successful, and you can have a much more harmonious association. And I hope the tips that, Robert, I've given you today, and I hope the articles that you'll be receiving in email or by download will help you, and you can circulate them among your colleagues and elevate the level of your association. Because as I love the slide that Robert uses, the future really is something that you can achieve. Wisdom, discipline, planning can get you there. You aren't going to fall into success. This isn't lottery country. This is, though, something that you can achieve, and we hope you will, and we really appreciate you listening today. So I'll pass it over to Paige for questions from our audience.
Okay, thank you, Robert and Kelly. That can, as I mentioned earlier, you can ask one of our presenters a question by typing your question into the question box at the bottom of your control panel.